The morning air held a particular chill, the kind that seeped through the heavy wool of a guardsman's greatcoat and settled deep in the bones. For Captain Alistair Finch, it was a familiar companion. He had stood sentry at the gates of Kensington Palace for the better part of a decade, a silent sentinel in a sea of scarlet and black bearskin. He had seen princes come and go, had witnessed the whirlwind of photographers that signified a royal arrival, and had learned to read the subtle shifts in the wind that preceded a changing of the guard. But his most consistent observation, the one that had quietly become the anchor of his long shifts, was the daily walk of the Duchess of Cambridge. Every morning, rain or shine, at precisely 10 o'clock, Kate would emerge from the private apartments. She was a study in quiet determination, often alone, her trainers making soft contact with the gravel path. Alistair had memorized her route. She would head first towards the sunken garden, a place of profound personal significance where she would pause, her gaze resting on the specific spot where her engagement photos had been taken. Her lips would barely move, a silent conversation with memory. Then she would continue towards the old oak tree near the round pond. Here she would reach out, her fingers tracing the grooves in the ancient bark, her head tilted as if listening to a voice only she could hear. It was a ritual of connection, a physical tether to moments and people that existed now only in her heart. Alistair, a man of discipline and routine, found a strange comfort in the predictability of it. It was a small, but human constant in the ever-changing pageantry of royal life. Then, everything shifted. The palace announced that the Princess of Wales was undergoing preventative chemotherapy. The world held its breath, and the palace grounds fell into an unnatural hush. The morning walks ceased. The 10 o'clock hour came and went, with a painful emptiness that Alistair felt in his chest as keenly as the cold. The sunken garden no longer had its silent observer, and the old oak tree stood alone. Weeks turned into months, a slow, anxious crawl of time. The atmosphere within the palace walls was one of respectful quietude, a collective holding of breath. Alistair performed his duties with his usual precision, but a part of him was always scanning the private entrance, hoping for a glimpse of the woman who had brought a quiet rhythm to his days. But the morning it changed began like any other gray London day. Alistair was at his post, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, when a flicker of movement from the corner of the palace caught his attention. It wasn't the measured, graceful stride of the princess. This was smaller, quicker, more hesitant. A small figure emerged, bundled in a coat that seemed a size too big, a flash of bright blonde hair escaping from under a woolen hat. It was Princess Charlotte. Alistair's posture remained ramrod straight, but his mind sharpened with focus. He watched as Charlotte looked left and right, as if checking to see if anyone was watching. Satisfied, she set off, not on a random path, but with a purpose that immediately struck Alistair as familiar. She walked directly towards the sunken garden, his breath caught in his throat. He watched her stop at the very same spot her mother always did. The little princess stood there for a long moment, her small frame still. Then, just as Kate had done, her lips moved in a silent, private whisper. Alistair felt a prickle at the back of his neck, a strange sense of witnessing something profoundly personal, a sacred ritual being inherited before his very eyes. Charlotte didn't linger. She turned, her small shoes scuffing the path, and headed towards the old oak tree. Alistair's heart hammered against his ribs. This was no coincidence. This was a replica, a perfect, heartbreakingly beautiful copy of a routine he alone had memorized. Charlotte reached up, her small hand patting the rough bark where her mother's hand had so often rested. She stood on her tiptoes, leaning in as if to share a secret with the ancient wood. and a sharp, cold wind whipped across the lawn, but Alistair didn't feel it. He was frozen, a witness to a love so powerful it was being expressed in footsteps and silence. The 10-year-old princess, with the weight of her mother's illness surely pressing on her young heart, was not playing. She was connecting. She was tracing the outlines of her mother's presence in the world, walking the same path, touching the same tree, whispering to the same ghosts in the garden. She was, in the only way she knew how, keeping her mother close. The revelation of that first morning settled over Alistair like a new duty. He found himself watching the clock not for the end of his shift, but for the approach of 10. He became the secret keeper of a little girl's pilgrimage. Day after day, Charlotte appeared. She was a ghost in her mother's footsteps. Then Alistair was the sole audience to this silent, poignant performance. He began to notice the smaller details, the nuances of her imitation. He remembered how Kate, in the months before her illness, would sometimes pause on her walk to pick a single flower, a sprig of rosemary or a small rose, tucking it into her pocket as if to carry a piece of the garden with her. One morning, a fortnight into Charlotte's solitary walks, he witnessed a new layer to the ritual. The princess was nearing the end of her circuit, approaching the final stretch that led back towards the palace. As she passed a particularly lush border of late autumn roses, she stopped. Alistair watched, barely breathing. Charlotte reached out a tentative hand, her fingers hovering over a deep crimson bloom. She looked around, just as her mother used to, a quick, though almost furtive glance. Then, with a delicacy that seemed beyond her years, she snapped the stem. She held the rose carefully, as if it were made of glass, brought it to her nose, and inhaled deeply. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. She then carefully tucked it into the pocket of her coat, just as Kate always had. Alistair felt a lump form in his throat. It was one thing to mimic a walk, a route that could be observed and copied. But this was different. This was an intimate gesture, a private moment of her mother's that Charlotte had internalized, perhaps without even knowing its origin. It was a habit observed and absorbed, a piece of her mother's soul that she was now wearing as her own. He saw her continue her walk, one small hand patting her pocket occasionally, as if to check the flower was still there. She was bringing a piece of the outside world, a piece of her mother's world, back inside with her. Then came the morning of the first heavy frost. The gardens were transformed into a glittering crystal palace, each blade of grass a tiny shard of glass. Alistair's breath plumed in the air as he stood his post. At 10 o'clock, Charlotte appeared, bundled even more snugly than usual. Her walk was slower today, her feet crunching on the frozen gravel. She made her way to the sunken garden, which was now a silent, sleeping beauty. The fountain was still, a thin skin of ice forming on the basin. She stood at her mother's spot, but this time, she didn't just whisper. Her little shoulders seemed to slump, and Alistair saw her shiver, though he couldn't tell if it was from the cold or from something else. And out to touch the bark, her small bare hand out to touch the bark, her small bare hand recoiled instantly. The tree was encased in a layer of frost, its surface cold and unwelcoming. Charlotte stared at her hand, then back at the tree. She tried again, more gently, pressing her palm flat against the icy trunk. She held it there, despite the cold. Alistair could see her jaw set with determination. She was holding on, quite literally, to this connection, refusing to let the cold steal it from her. She leaned in, her lips moving, staying a little longer than usual, as if the message she had to deliver was longer, more urgent. When she finally pulled away, she blew on her reddened hand to warm it, and then shoved it deep into her pocket. She turned to go, and as she passed the frozen rose bushes, she didn't even glance at them. There would be no flower today. Alistair understood. Some days, the ritual was about gathering beauty. Other days, it was simply about enduring. He watched her small, determined figure make its way back inside, a tiny splash of color against a vast, monochrome winter scene. The weight of her silent vigil and of the secret he now shared felt heavier than his wool greatcoat. A full season had passed since Princess Charlotte began her solitary walks. The frost had long since thawed, giving way to the tender green shoots of spring. The sunken garden was beginning its annual resurrection, a riot of color pushing through the dark, damp earth. Alistair had chronicled it all through the eyes of the little princess. And he had watched her walk through the biting wind, the relentless rain, and the first shy rays of spring sunshine. Her commitment had never wavered. 10 o'clock, every day. She had become as reliable as the changing of the guard itself. Throughout these months, Alistair had observed other things, too. He had seen the private entrance to the apartments, the one Charlotte used, and he had noticed the careful, quiet ways the world tried to support her. Sometimes, a nanny would watch from the doorway. Other times, a protection officer would linger at a discreet distance. They were there to ensure her safety, but Alistair understood their true purpose. They were there to let her have this. They were guarding not just her person, but her sacred ritual. He had also seen, on rare, precious occasions, at the face of the Princess of Wales at an upstairs window. She would appear for only a moment, a pale figure watching her daughter trace her old path through the gardens below. It was a silent, mutual act of love. The mother watching over the daughter who was, in her own way, watching over her. The day it culminated was unseasonably warm, a gift of a day that felt like summer had arrived early. The palace gardens were alive with the sound of birds and the heady scent of blooming flowers. Alistair stood at his post, but his focus, as always now, was on the small figure he expected to see. At 10 o'clock, Charlotte emerged. But today, something was different. Her step was lighter, quicker. She didn't walk with the solemn, measured pace of her ritual. She practically skipped towards the sunken garden. Alistair watched, curious. She reached her spot and turned to face the palace, not the garden. And then, Alistair saw it. The door to the private apartments was open, and there, stepping out into the sunlight, leaning on the arm of a smiling nurse but standing on her own 2 feet, was Catherine, the Princess of Wales. Her face was thinner, etched with the battle she had fought, but her eyes were clear and bright, and they were fixed on her daughter. Charlotte didn't move. She stood perfectly still in the garden, her hands clasped in front of her. Then, with a grace that belonged to queens and the little girls who loved them, Charlotte executed a deep, perfect curtsy. It wasn't a gesture of royal protocol. It was a gesture of profound respect, of overwhelming relief, of a love so deep it could only be expressed through the body. Kate, with tears streaming down her face, waved. It wasn't a royal wave. It was a mother's wave, a trembling, joyful gesture that said, "I'm here, I'm back, I see you." And then, the ritual that had been one of solitude and memory transformed into one of reunion. Kate began to walk, slowly but deliberately, down the path towards the sunken garden. Charlotte, after a heartbeat of hesitation, ran. She ran as fast as her legs could carry her, her joyful shout carrying on the warm spring air. They met in the middle of the lawn, just a few yards from the old oak tree. Kate knelt down, her arms open wide, and Charlotte launched herself into them. The embrace was fierce, a